Hello guys, and welcome to this new video in the game engine series. Hope you guys are doing good. We have been talking about entity component system in the two previous videos, and we've created, for example, our base component class and our base system class. We even talk about creating like a component array, our component list, which was actually meant to store our component. So if you're watching this video for the first time, I'm pretty sure you want to go and watch those videos first. I always provide a link in the description below. We're building a game engine in OpenGL using C++ and ImGui, and the idea is to build this from scratch, and that's why we're actually building our entity component system. In today's video, we're going to be moving forward in our entity component system and add our entity manager. I think the name itself is self-explanatory. Entity manager means he manages the entities. The manager is going to be the guy in charge of connecting the entities with the component and the system. So he's going to be checking if an entity has a signature, the same signature as a system, then he will try to put the entity and the system together. If I want to add a component to an entity, he's going to be the guy who will search for the entity and attach in the right memory, in the right place in the memory where I can find it again and use it for other purposes. So all these kind of things, register component arrays, register system, disable system, and things like that. So I'm gonna make a quick review about the base component class and the base system class. The base component class is basically just a simple structure that has an entity ID as data, which is private, which can only be accessed by the entity manager. So make sure you correct this because the name is not manager but entity manager. And the same thing with the base system. It has I want to update here entity manager. So it has a signature and the list of entity that belongs to him. So if an entity has the same signature as this, then he's going to be storing that entity ID and use that to call update. Now I didn't spoke about these visual functions right here. Now I think you know what this means. So every system I'm gonna create will have a start function to initialize anything. I mean, it depends on what you actually want to do with that system. We have the update function, which will update the system, and the destroy, which will destroy everything if there is anything to destroy anyway. So that's basically the base system and the base component class. And we also had the component list, which was basically a wrapper on a vector array. So because we want to be able to search things in the memory, search the component with the same entity ID as the one we have right now and things like that. So please watch the previous video so that you don't get confused about things that we're doing here. Now I already created my entity manager class. As you can see, I created a header file in my base folder. So I will invite you to also do the same, create an entity class. As you can see here, you include type base component and base system, because we're going to be using that here to do some stuff. So this is basically the definition of our entity manager. Now we want to add all our private member variables that we're going to be using. Now the reason why it's still putting this red stuff here, because we didn't include this in a C++ file. So if I go ahead and include it here, let me say include, and I am doing the ECS and then this, and I say entity manager, then we basically have the problem gone, and this should be entity signature. And what is the problem with this guy here? I component list, we have type included. No, we didn't include component list, so we want to include component list, and we have it done. So I think it's more readable now. So we have the entity count. This guy here will simply store how many entity actually created, how many entity we have right now. So this is basically the idea. Now we also have available entities. As you can see, it's just a curve. We're gonna be using a curve to actually manage the entity IDs, because we have a limit amount of entity that we can create, which is a number that we can change anytime. That's not a problem. So we actually need like a curve here to actually we always go and grab the value at the end or in the beginning of the queue, and that will be the next ID of the next entity that we create. So that's why we have available entities. I could have said available entity IDs, but I just say entities because entities are just entity ID basically. So you can see here we'll store all the signature of all entities. So we simply take the entity ID and the signature. So every time we create an entity, we're also gonna have an entity signature created for that entity, in which we're gonna store all the component of that entity. I mean all the component signature of that entity. Because if you remember from the type here, the signature will simply is a set which will store the component type ID. And since it's a set, it will never have a value twice, because in a set, when you add the same value twice, it's only gonna store one for that. That's the reason why we're using the set here. So this is basically it. This is gonna store the signature of our entities. And down here we have the registered system. We haven't created system yet, but we're going to be creating like the physics system. We're going to be creating the renderer, the material renderer system. We're going to be creating a camera system. We're going to be creating a light system and all of that. And we want to be able to register those systems in here. And we're using unique pointer here because there is only one, and we don't want to be sharing that with anyone and things like that. And that's why we have the system ID and the pointer to that system. So we're going to be creating that later. The next one are the component array. So in this map here, we're actually storing all of our component types. So this is a map of component array. This is a map of array. If you remember, our component array is nothing but just a vector on top of which we have written function to get, set, and remove values. So that's basically the idea. So we're actually storing a map of vector in which we have all the component type. And if you remember, I said we have the I component list because we want to be able to store all kind of component array, like for transform, for rigid body and stuff. So that's basically the private member of our entity manager. Let's implement what the constructor should do. Now the constructor is basically going to be preparing our entities. So I'm just going to change this. You see, we're just going to be pushing entities in our queue so that we have the amount of entity according to the max entity count. That's basically the idea. So we simply start and we push the data, and we have, like in our case, it's going to be 5,000 entities. So we'll be able to always take the value from the queue and use that as entity ID. Now the destructor will not have anything yet. We're going to leave it like that for now. The next thing we want to implement is a function to actually add entity. We want to actually do that by saying entity ID. So it's going to return an entity first, const entity. I'm going to say add new entity. So this function will return an entity ID. It will create an entity and return the value of that entity. So that's why we'll simply go out and say const entity ID and available entity. Let me update this name because we get the value, at the front of our queue here. This is going to be the current entity ID. So do it like this. And this will basically create that, and we want to make sure we pop to actually make sure that ID is not available anymore because we have it created. We basically want to say entity count, want to increase. And one thing I forgot to mention, you want to initialize the entity count here with 0 because we want it to be 0 when we start our entity manager. And we simply increase the entity count and we can return the entity ID. This entity ID will then be used to be able to access some component and things like that. So that's basically how we can actually do this. Now we also want to implement a function to remove an entity. This function is going to be a void, say destroy entity. It needs to take the entity ID we want to destroy, because destroying an entity involve removing it from all systems, involve deleting its component and things like that. So that's why we want to know the entity ID. So and therefore we first of all want to make sure this entity is not out of range. That's really important. That's why we simply check if the entity is not bigger than our max entity count. That's why we say entity out of range. You want to make sure you write that, because this will prevent you from doing something crazy, and this will also help debugging the code when we have some messy stuff going around, because dealing with memory is quite difficult sometimes. So, and we want to go out and say entity signature. Here we want to erase entity signature, this one instead, entity signatures. You want to erase the signature of that if it's actually exists. So you want to say entity, remove the signature of that entity, and the next thing is to remove the components of that entity. And for that one, we need to actually, we need a loop, and we say auto. I want to say component array, or maybe let's say, and so we simply want to go and grab this guy here. So if you remember from our component array, we have arrays here which takes the entity ID. So that's the reason why we simply want to destroy, anything about the guy. And we're doing that for all arrays to make sure we destroy all the component of that entity. And now we also want to unregister that from any system. So I'm just gonna copy this and paste it here. But now I want to copy this and do this, and I'm gonna say system. Now there's still one thing to do, entity count. You want to make sure you remove the count because we have one entity less. So you want to decrement the entity count. And now you want to make sure you put this entity, you make this entity ID available, because we can now use this entity again. So we're gonna push this at the back of our queue so that we can now reuse it. You see, that's basically the idea. Available entities will save. So this is basically how we can add and remove entities. What if we can test this and see if it's working? Now I haven't debugged the code since the previous video, and many things can happen, so don't get nervous if things get wrong right now. So we have it included. I want to remove this because just to be able to test. Now let's say we create a manager. We're going to say entity manager. We need the ECS entity manager, and we can say manager. It has a default constructor, so I don't have to define it as a pointer or anything like that. So I can say manager, add new entity, and here I can say auto ID equal this. So I can actually print out the entity here. So let me say ID here, ID, and I want to be able to put something here and put some space. So let's try if this is not crashing, because as I said, I haven't tested this, so anything can happen. So we're trying to see if it's gonna work. It's compiling. So there we have our first problem. Syntax error, we have a small problem. Forgot to put something here. What is the matter? Component type, maybe the name of this function is not right. Component type, how did I call it? Comp type. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, you see, let me go back in this base system, and here we have comp type. So that's the name I should be using. So let me run this again. You see, we have the component ID, the entity ID, which is 0, and the component ID, which is also 0. Now to make sure this is working, let's go and add another entity. So maybe like 3. I have 1, 2, and here we want to make sure we also add that to the roster. So we have ID 1, and we want to also make sure we remove that. Later we're gonna test the remove. So let's run this and see, and you can see we have entity 0, entity 1, and 2, and that's basically the idea of that. Now what if before we do this we remove, we say manager mgr, So I want to print this before and after we delete. So I print this before, so we don't have the two. Now we create this first one here, add entity, which is 0, and we add this one, which is 1, and we print it here. That's normal. Now we destroy the entity 1. That means the entity 2 should be 1 because we made that entity ID available. I got the reason. The reason is because when you destroy, this is going to be pushed back at the end of our queue, so it's not going to be used directly. That's the reason why we'll keep using the value contiguously. So when we get to the end of our queue, then we will start using the value that was deleted. That's the reason why this guy didn't get the value. But so far everything's working properly. In the next video, we're going to be adding the component, the add component, the remove component, get and has component functions to actually be able to access the component of an entity. So that's all for this video. Hope you guys learned something from it. If you guys have any question or any concern, make sure you write in the description below. And I also want to remind you guys that you can get the source code on my Patreon page. There you will find also all information if you want to get the current stage of the game engine. And so thank you for watching. Have a nice day or whatever. Ciao.